I think one might say that that while there are no specifically esoteric teachings in the Baha'i faith, in a way, there are secrets and mysteries abound in the Baha'i writings, but they're there for all to see. It's a matter of interpreting the mystery that's there in front of you in the right way. And oftentimes there's a external meaning to it and an internal meaning to it. And this is one of the topics we'll be circling back to over and over the next few weeks. Abdu'l-Baha said even more explicitly during his travels in the West in 1913, he said, "In this cause of God, there is no secret doctrine or secret society or club or gathering. I want you to be impressed with the importance of this fact, that there is no secret doctrine in this cause at all." And with regard to the idea that mysticism is somehow identified with having a certain special experience, there is, I think, some very helpful clarification on this, first by Shoghi Effendi, and then, as I'll show you, by some other thinkers from previous ages who think their way through this, because this is one of the, I think, subtle aspects of the topic, that on the one hand, it's not about having an experience. On the other hand, it's all about having an experience. And somehow these two are both simultaneously true. Let's see what Shoghi Effendi says about this. In 1929, he said that, in reference to Ralph Waldo Emerson, he said, "People like Emerson were undoubtedly inspired by God, for many of the thoughts that quicken us in this day were uttered and stimulated by them. Only gradually will we come to appreciate their work and place them in the growing world of ours. The tendency of these writers, however, is rather to diminish rather than to enhance the position of the prophet in civilization. These bid us come into communion with God by looking within us. They tell us that the prophets were humans and that we can become like them if we only strive. This renders religion the religion of the few, the religion of only those who have experiences." And on this idea about what is religion about, is religion about an individual having a transcendent experience, or is it about something more than that? This thought and this problem was addressed by one of the original mystics, Plotinus, kind of a crossover figure. He was half philosopher and half mystic, a follower of the philosophy of Plato, which even in his time in the late Roman Empire was already ancient philosophy, hundreds of years old. But Plotinus had the following thought about this. He said, "This is why pleasure is not self-sufficient, for one is not satisfied with the same thing. For what pleasure is satisfied with, again, is not the same. For that which gives one pleasure is always something else. Certainly, the good which one chooses must be something which is not the feeling one has when one attains it. That is why the one who takes this for good remains empty, because he only has the feeling which one might get from the good." So the pursuit of the good, which was the central objective of the Greek philosophers, and which Plotinus really transformed into almost an ecstatic practice. Even Plotinus realized that this pursuit of the good is something other than what kind of personal experience or pleasure one might take in the pursuit of an attainment of that good. A very similar thought was expressed by one of the great mystics of Christianity, St. John of the Cross, in the 1500s. And he said, really made the same point with slightly different words. He said, "If a man is moved to love God apart from any sweetness he feels, he is already focusing his love upon God, whom he does not feel. If he sets his will upon pleasurable and consoling feelings, thinking about them and resting in them, he is setting his will on creatures or related things, making them into an end instead of a means. That man would be very ignorant who thinks that because sweetness and delight are failing him, God is failing him, or should think that in having these, he is having God. He would be still more ignorant if he followed God looking for sweetness and rejoiced and rested in it when obtained. So if mysticism is not, properly speaking, is not esoteric teachings, it's not having a particular experience, it's not, following a spiritual leader or going off as a hermit to have an exclusively kind of spiritual experience, then what is mysticism? What do we mean when we talk about it? Because far from being something extraneous or something irrelevant, it is in fact the heart of it all. It is the point and purpose of it all. And Shoghi Effendi, again, puts it in the following terms. He says, the core of religious faith is that mystical feeling which unites man with God. This state of spiritual communion can be brought about and maintained by means of meditation and prayer. It is not sufficient for a believer to merely accept and observe the teachings. He should, in addition, cultivate the sense of spirituality, which he can acquire chiefly by means of prayer. The Baha'i faith, like all other divine religions, is thus fundamentally mystic in character. But what we mean by mystic and how that mysticism is expressed, again, may be different from how it has evolved and how we see it on the bookstore shelves today. Elsewhere, he grants the validity of mystical experience by individuals. He says in a letter in 1939, it is very difficult to distinguish between true visions, which are true spiritual experiences of the soul, and imaginations, which have no reality and spiritual truths. True visions, however, can be granted to those who are spiritually pure and receptive, and are not therefore confined to the prophets alone. But the Guardian encourages a great deal of caution with this. And in one of his letters, he says the following: truly mystical experiences based on reality are very rare, and we can readily see how dangerous it is for people to go groping about in the darkness of their imagination after the true thing. If we're going to have some deeply spiritual experience, we can rest assured God will vouchsafe it to us without our having to look for it. So it's a reality, but something, the experience of which as the thing in itself is not something we should seek. And so we can start to ask about what an attempted definition of it is. And I'll be using in the sessions to come primarily the Baha'i writings, but I'll also be looking at what other thinkers, philosophers, religious figures, and contemporary figures have said and thought about this, where it seems useful. Sometimes useful in the sense of contrasting and comparing, of drawing out the distinction between what the view of the Baha'i writings is and what others have thought about it. One exploration of this topic, which I found very useful, and this dates from the early 20th century, was from the German theologian Rudolf Otto, who wrote a book about this experience, the mystical experience, which he called The Idea of the Holy. But in the opening pages, he realized that the word holiness or sacredness was not exactly capturing what he wanted to study, which was this experience of the mystical. And so he coined a word which you may have heard or may not have heard before, and the word is the numinous, and it's derived from a Latin word. And he he defines it, or he attempts to define it here. And I think we may find this a helpful starting point when as we explore the subject. He says, it will be our endeavor to suggest this unnamed something to the reader as far as we may, so that he may himself feel it. There is no religion in which it does not live as the real innermost core, and without it, no religion would be worthy of the name. It cannot, strictly speaking, be taught. It can only be evoked, awakened in the mind, as everything that comes of the spirit must be awakened. And then his, I think, a famous attempted definition of it is in the following 2 slides. He says, let us consider the deepest and most fundamental element in all strong and sincerely felt religious emotion. Faith unto salvation, trust, love, all these are there. But over and above these is an element which may also on occasion, quite apart from them, profoundly affect us and occupy the mind with a well-nigh bewildering strength. Let us follow it up with every effort of sympathy and imaginative intuition wherever it is to be found, in the lives of those around us, in sudden, strong ebullitions of personal piety and the frames of mind such ebullitions evince, in the fixed and ordered solemnities of rites and liturgies, and again, in the atmosphere that clings to old religious monuments and buildings, to temples and to churches. If we do so, we shall find we are dealing with something for which there's only one appropriate expression, mysterium tremendum. The feeling of it may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with the tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may pass over into a more set and lasting attitude of the soul, continuing, as it were, thrillingly vibrant and resonant, until at last it dies away and the soul resumes its profane, non-religious mood of everyday experience. It may burst in sudden eruption up from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport, and to ecstasy. Again, it may be developed into something beautiful and pure and glorious. It may become the hushed, trembling, and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of whom or what? In the presence of that which is a mystery, inexpressible, and above all creatures. So this definition, attempted definition of the core of the mystical experience has been very influential among theologians and sociologists of religion over the years. But we should not, I think, take this as the final word on the subject, but rather how one might approach it really from a Christian perspective, because there are different flavors of different modes of mystical experience. And as Rudolf Otto himself in later writings explores, there's even a kind of a different feeling, a different way of describing mystical experience, depending on whether you are coming from the Western theological tradition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or the Eastern theological traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. And we'll be coming back to this topic in sessions to come. And further to this idea of contrasting how people have thought about the mystical and mystical experience, I want to contrast 2 definitions. The first, and this is an extremely influential definition of religion by William James in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was published in the first part of the 20th century. And he was very fascinated by the experience of the mystical by people around the world. And he wrote this quite influential book that is filled with case studies of different people who had mystical experiences of different kinds. And behind his study, he was, I think, before he was a theologian or a philosopher, he was really a psychologist. And so he was looking at the experience of religion as a psychological phenomenon. And for him, religion was primarily an individual experience. And that deeply informed not only his understanding of and pursuit of this topic of the mystical, but it also influenced generations of philosophers and theologians after him. And this is the definition. It's quite simple, but I think you might after hearing it already get some idea of where the contrasting definition may go. He says, religion shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. I'll read that again. Religion shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. Since the relation may be either moral, physical, or ritual, it is evident that out of religion, in the sense in which we take it, theologies, philosophies, and ecclesiastical organizations may secondarily grow. So for William James, and for really a whole generation of people who thought about and wrote about these subjects, religion at its core was an individual experience, which then later became organized. Clergy arose, theologies and philosophies arose to justify it or to give order or coherence to it. But at its core, there's an individual experience. And this is how he defines religion. And I would like to contrast that, because I think in understanding the contrast between William James and Abdu'l-Baha, we will, I think we will gain some insight into where this subject of mysticism is going to take us in the context of the Baha'i writings. Here's how Abdu'l-Baha defines religion. Almost diametrically, on a completely different level. And this is from Some Answer Questions, chapter 40 of Some Answer Questions. Abdu'l-Baha says, briefly, the universal manifestations of God are aware of the truths underlying the mysteries of all created things. And thus they found a religion that is based upon and consonant with the prevailing condition of humanity. For religion consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. And then later in this chapter, he concludes, religion then consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. The universal manifestations of God, being aware of the mysteries of creation, are fully informed of these necessary relationships and establish them as the religion of God. So such a contrast from William James's definition of religion as an experience that then becomes a collective, a collective thing with theology and philosophy attached to it, and a religious hierarchy and so forth. For Abdu'l-Baha, he doesn't define religion in terms of an initial individual experience, but he defines it as consisting in the necessary relationships that derive from the realities of things. This, I think, is an important starting point for explorations into, say, the nature of the mystical experience from a Baha'i perspective. It's also a starting point for an understanding of Abdu'l-Baha's principle, or the principle expressed perhaps most precisely by Abdu'l-Baha, but certainly implied in the writings of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, of the unity of science and religion. Because elsewhere, Abdu'l-Baha defines nature in identical terms as he identifies religion here. He says in his tablet to Dr. Farrell that nature consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. So this idea then of religion as being somehow intimately tied into the connections between things that spills over, between what we may regard as the spiritual domain and the material domain, because everything is all connected in one web of interrelationships. This way of understanding religion, and consequently, this way of understanding the mystical experience, leads us in a way away from the traditional theological conceptions of Western religion, by which I mean Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, and more in the direction of Eastern religion, but also in the direction of more indigenous spiritual practices. And I found this recently, and this is not from, unfortunately, I couldn't find a text, like an authoritative text from an indigenous tradition, but this is from a scholar who wrote about this. And what she said about it, I think, has, for me, deep resonances with how Abdu'l-Baha defines and redefines religion. And she writes here that the mystical experience indigenous to the native North American tribal people stands out uniquely in the history of religions, and that it is grounded in the vision of a sacred world which underlies, envelops, and is manifestly present within the entire empirical order. The sacred dimension, although being qualitatively different from the phenomenal realm, is not regarded as otherworldly or transcendentally beyond in the same way as it is meant in a monotheistic or monistic apprehension of the divine. In this sense, the Native American does not transcend the world in the Christian or Vedantic or Neoplatonic manner. Rather, he plunges into the world and experiences himself and the earth with all its myriad phenomena as being totally immersed in and revelatory of the divine reality. So this statement, and unfortunately, I will not, because I don't have the knowledge base to do to take this to take this idea very far as it relates to indigenous traditions and the Native North American tradition. But I think there are fascinating connections here to be made. But when it comes then to describing what we might call experiences of the mystical in the Baha'i writings, I wanted to start this session with a few examples. And one example I'll give is from Baha'u'llah in his Kitab-i-Iqan, the Book of Certitude, in a passage that is probably well known to many of you. And it comes at the end of his description of the essential prerequisites of the true seeker. And it's a several page long section in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, where he describes how the true seeker, as they embark upon their spiritual quest, must fulfill certain prerequisites, such as purity of heart and there are 18 or 19 of these essential prerequisites of not backbiting, not speaking ill of others, of rising at the dawn of every day with devotion, and as the seeker reaches the city of certitude, Baha'u'llah describes the entrance to that city in ways which I think can fairly be termed mystical. And he says it in the following way: at that hour will the mystic herald bearing the joyful tidings of the Spirit shine forth from the city of God, resplendent as the morn, and through the trumpet blast of knowledge will awaken the heart, the soul, and the spirit from the slumber of negligence. Then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the Holy and Everlasting Spirit confers such new life upon the seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation. And that reminds me of that statement that we just read about the Native American tradition, that the mystical experience is had not by removing oneself transcendentally from the world, but by plunging into it. And there's this sense of seeing within every atom the doors that lead to absolute certitude. There's that sense here, I think, in Baha'u'llah's words also, of seeing the reflection of the divine within all things, which I think implies a mode of mystical contemplation and experience, which is fundamentally not that of disassociating from the world, of somehow cutting the bond between us and the world and then floating free, but rather changing one's perception in a way that allows one to see that divine light shining within every atom, within every human soul. In another tablet, Baha'u'llah says even more directly, "Know then, O my brother, that God is possessed of a hidden grace, of a concealed bounty, and of unfathomed worlds which are unknown to all save them that soar upon the wings of the Spirit into the atmosphere of his nearness." Early Baha'is have written in a very mystical vein about their experiences with the writings of Baha'u'llah. And George Townsend is one of them. And I'm just picking a couple examples from many that could have that I could have brought. But this one really spoke to me, and it's in a couple of slides. He says, "There is a note, a music, a voice in the writings of Baha'u'llah, even in translations, which never was heard in English literature before, and which has such power that it seems to shake the air as one reads. If other proof were lacking, this mighty voice would be proof enough. The vibrations of Baha'u'llah's writings are so intense, they shiver me with an exaltation and a power I can hardly stand, like standing out in a great storm with the winds roaring and the waves raging, and the trees shrieking and crashing, and the whole scene uplifting one with its tremendous power and energy and beauty till one is transported and feels part of the titanic drama. I think men will have to develop a lot before they can react rhythmically to Baha'u'llah's writings. Perhaps we are not meant to. The infinite has come among us, nearer than ever before, and we are stunned by its presence." Another early believer, this is Louise Waite, had a very interesting conversation with Abdu'l-Baha in 1909. And so this is a pilgrim note, but she recalls it in the following words. And she was with a Mrs. Harrison, and they were having an interview with Abdu'l-Baha. And Mrs. Harrison asked, "What was the cause of the sensation often experienced by both of us, which felt as if an essence were falling upon the top of the head, and a sensation flowing down around the face and on into the heart?" She mentioned Aaron's beard. "Also like irrigation. Was it merely a physical sensation, imaginary or wrong?" And she's this Aaron's beard reference is in Psalm 133, and at the bottom it says, "It is," and this is from the Psalm, "It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard that went down to the skirts of his garments, as the dew of Hermon, and as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore." And so she asked Abdu'l-Baha, I have this sensation, what is up with this? And Abdu'l-Baha says, no, it is not a physical condition, but spiritual, a very high one, which is so intense, it reaches the nerves, and these react upon the body. When one is spiritually developed, the body responds to spiritual conditions or emotions. One wonders if this is at all, if this has anything to do with the experience that Baha'u'llah described in the Siyah Chal in Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. He said, during the days I lay in the prison of Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still in those infrequent moments of slumber, I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitateth itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain. Every limb of my body would, as a result, be set afire. At such moments, my tongue recited what no man could bear to hear. And other early believers would ask Abdu'l-Baha, they wanted to have their mystical experience, and they would write to Abdu'l-Baha and say, what do I have to do to get, to have this experience? And as we've noted, Shoghi Effendi, by and large, warns against the pursuit of the experience itself. But there are tablets where Abdu'l-Baha basically says, here's what you do. And this is one of these tablets. He said, verily I say unto thee, that if for the appearance of that divine essence, thou desirest to have a definite proof, an indisputable testimony, and a strong, convincing evidence, thou must prepare thyself to make thy heart empty and thine eye ready to look only toward the kingdom of God. Then at that time, the radiance of that widespread effulgence will descend upon thee successively. One wonders, I'm pulling together these different quotations and suggesting there's a connection between them, but ultimately it's up to you to decide if there's something behind this pulling things together in this way. So we will be looking in the weeks to come and maybe refining our understanding or definition of what mysticism is. And I wanted to just start with a few proposed definitions. One of them is the unsought experience of the numinous. There is a dimension of experience involved. The apprehension of what lies behind the world of appearances, the passage to a higher degree of consciousness, or perhaps the perception of interconnectedness, or maybe more generally, the personal dimension of the spiritual path. And we'll be looking at many of Baha'u'llah's mystical writings, which primarily date from the Baghdad period, where he describes this the sequence of steps and stages in the mystical pathway, and we'll be comparing and contrasting different stages as described in various mystical tablets, which we will find, I think, have a very common progression in how Baha'u'llah describes them. So in these future sessions, we're going to be looking, maybe taking one or two sessions each for topics such as the symbolic languages of the divine, how God is described in Baha'u'llah's writings, and we'll be looking especially at what is called cataphatic and apophatic theology, or positive and negative theology, or different ways of defining, of describing the divine, some of which describe the divine in positive terms, what God is, and others which define or describe God in negative terms, in terms of what God isn't. And it's really the latter that is more the province of traditional mystical thought and experience. We'll be looking at Baha'i writings on the nature of the soul, and in particular, its essential union with the divine and with other souls. We'll be looking at ways of knowing, epistemological principles, the way of the heart, the way of the mind, the way of inspiration, the way of tradition. We're going to be looking at states of consciousness and degrees of spirit. This is where writings such as the Seven Valleys will be discussed. The path of transformation, and finally mysticism and community life. So that is what I had in mind, and what I hope will happen is that my presentation will be, say, half an hour, 45 minutes, and then I hope that there'll be plenty of time when I'm finished to open it up for conversation. So it looks like we're about 45 minutes in, so this, the timing of this was about right. So why don't I stop sharing and open up the floor for any questions or thoughts or reactions. And partly based on where the conversation goes, that's going to help define where these whole courses are going to go, because I haven't written everything out already, but depending on what your interests are, that's going to help shape the content. So thanks for listening up to this point. I see some hands raised. I don't know who's first. I see Sanaz Khosravi is first on my upper left on my Zoom. So maybe you could go first.
Thank you for the great presentation. My question is about the first quote that you shared from Abdu'l-Baha about the secret doctrines. Can you give us some examples of secret doctrines in other faiths or traditions, and what was the context of that quote? Thank you.
It might have been, I'm not sure what the context was, but it very well could have been in the context of other esoteric groups such as Freemasons, which have a very defined sequence of stages of initiatory stages that one goes through, up to, I think, 30 or more degrees. And there's certain doctrines that are revealed only in those later stages. Another more modern example, which wouldn't have been around at Abdu'l-Baha's time, is Scientology, where you go through, certain stages, and then at some point, the inner mysteries are revealed to you, and it has something to do with volcanoes and 747s or something. So those are a couple of examples. An interesting example from the early years of the Baha'i faith, one of the prolific early teachers who later became a covenant breaker, Ibrahim Khairullah, had a great deal of success teaching the Baha'i faith in the late 1890s in America, to people who really loved this idea of getting in on the secret doctrines. And Khairullah had this sequence of courses that he would take interested people through, promising that at the end he would reveal the secret. And so people were motivated to sort of hear what the secret was. And at the end he revealed the secret. It was the greatest name. And so that it was, it was packaged up in those early years as, the secret knowledge that you get at the end in a sort of initiatory way. Of course, Abdu'l-Baha says all of this is nonsense and that there's no such thing in the Baha'i writings. But again, the secrets are everywhere, but they're all there for everyone to see. And that's, I think, going to be a lot of the fun I'm anticipating us having as we go through and as we look at many of these writings, and suggest suggest whether some of them may be saying one thing on the surface but really meaning another thing underneath. That's the kind of thing that that I look forward to having conversations about. So Roya and Farhad, I see another hand. I don't know if your hand was next, but it is raised.
I think James was next. So I'll let him go first.
James,
yeah.
You're next.
All right, cool, thanks. I just had a brief question. maybe might clarify. Are you going to be posting the slides? Maybe, obviously not like the whole set, but like all of them, because I'm very tempted to try and screenshot all of them.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't want you to have to do that. Yeah, I will. Yeah, gladly share the slides at the end of each session. We'll have to find a way for me to do it, because not everyone who is participating is like on the same. There isn't like one unified email list at the moment.
I've got it, Stephen. You can send it to me.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So Roy and Farhad.
First of all, thank you so much for these classes. I'm really looking forward to them. I know these classes are about mysticism, but I cannot like help think about like the science and the scientific aspects. And like I feel like there is a lot of like some scientists who feel some sort of mystical experience when thinking about nature in terms of the laws of the nature and stuff. And I was wondering if there is any framework that we could think about like mysticism in scientific terms, like in terms of how can we like, because we've heard a lot of like talk about mysticism like since like old religions, like there's a lot of talk about these experiences, but is it possible to have some sort of a scientific approach to it as well, especially in the Baha'i writings?
Yeah, great question. I think we'll definitely devote time to that, and if there's interest, I can easily devote a session or two that focus more on that. Some of the early architects of quantum mechanics, modern physics, Schrodinger and others, were profoundly affected, influenced by what they saw, how nature actually worked, apparently with the participation of an observer that is inextricably intertwined with that which is observed. And many of these physicists who were not religious men in any traditional sense, nevertheless had mystical suspicions and thought about quantum mechanics in mystical terms. So from the very origins of modern physics in the 20th century, there was a mystical strain coming in from the architects themselves. At the same time, sort of from the other end, from the Baha'i writings, there is, and not just the Baha'i writings, but I think allied to the Baha'i writings, much of the mystical tradition of East and West that is of a non-dualistic angle, I think offers a way of thinking about and understanding the mystical experience, which is entirely in conformity with the mathematical laws of physics as we understand it. In other words, mysticism does not have to be understood as a kind of magic or a kind of supernatural disruption of the regular sequence of events that the laws of physics dictate. And I think we can definitely spend some time looking at some Baha'i writings which suggest that. I mean, among them, Baha'u'llah's Tablet of Wisdom, where he identifies the operation of the primal will in the world with nature. And Some Answered Questions, where Abdu'l-Baha says nature and nature's laws are, in chapter 1 of Some Answered Questions, he said nature's laws are never contravened. They are they're never suspended, and it's not hard to sort of put those together into a vision of the world, which, because the spiritual and the physical dimensions have in a way been collapsed into one interrelated whole, and spirit then becomes more a perspective, a way of viewing the world from a particular direction rather than a particular kind of occult or invisible substance that has its own causal chain. if one is able to think of spirit and matter from a more monistic lens, which is really what the mystics of East and West tended to do, then I think that points a way forward to a very profound reconciliation of science and religion. Jason.
I believe Arya was first.
Oh, Arya, you're next. Okay, so everyone's seeing this in the same order then. Arya, you are upper left corner.
Thank you. This is amazing, Stephen. Thank you so much. When you had the slide up about how Abdu'l-Baha was describing certain physical changes that can happen in a person due to spiritual effects, I started remembering about, I don't know where I heard this, but stories about what would happen to Baha'u'llah while he was revealing writings, and how he would sometimes become physically sick and get a fever and would sweat a lot, and just, you know, had involuntary physical things happen to him as the result of revelation. And I'm wondering if you think that is mysticism, or what that is.
I think it's similar to, it's also said that Muhammad, when he would reveal verses, also a state came over him, and he would ask Khadija, his wife, to throw his cloak over his face, because so that others wouldn't be disturbed by it. So it isn't just Baha'u'llah. I think it absolutely wouldn't be surprising to me that that concomitantly with the revelation of divine verses, a physical change would come over the revealer. Why wouldn't that be the case? Especially if the physical and material dimensions are really, aspects of one reality, then we would expect, in the same way that, that when monks are hooked up to an EKG machine and then they're asked to meditate, and lo and behold, there are changes in the brainwave patterns when the monk enters a deep state of meditation. So why would we be surprised that what we think of and identify as a spiritual state has some physical trace associated with it, whether that be visible in the case of of breaking into a sweat or whatever the case may be, or whether it's visible through other scientific instrumentation. I don't think we should be surprised that the two are connected.
Thank you.
So Jason.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much overlap there is between mysticism and cosmology and metaphysics, and if we'll get a chance to talk about those topics specifically.
Oh, a lot. If you want to, it can be mostly that. Well, I mean, one of my favorite mystic, non-mystic physicists is Johnny Wheeler, who coined the term black hole, but also had other really great ideas. He was at Princeton when I was there, and it was his last years. He was in his 90s, I think, and so I have some personal recollection of him. But he was famously a non-conventional thinker, brilliant physicist. At the same time, had the suspicion that cosmology ultimately had to be wrapped up into the quantum mechanical problem of the observer and the observed. In other words, he asked the question, well, what brings the cosmos into being? And of course, rather than the theological answer, well, God brought it into being, because that just begs the question, well, what brought God into being if God is part of the causal nexus? Instead, John Wheeler's idea was, well, maybe the universe brought itself into being through a spontaneous act of self-observation, which he called it from bit. And if you could Google search it from bit and John Wheeler, and you'll come up with this paper on this, which I love it, because it's like taking totally from the perspective of a physicist, but like landing, I think, more or less precisely on this very spiritual idea of the circle of existence, which Abdu'l-Baha in later chapters of Some Answer Questions says is like the heart of divine philosophy, the idea of the arcs of ascent and descent, which is a continual ontological circle of creation of emanation and return, which is deeply tied into some Sufi ideas and actually goes back to Plotinus, which we can easily spend 1 or 2 sessions on as well, because this is some of the, I think, mystical heart of it all. Is that viewed from one perspective, the universe can be seen as a mode of the divine self-recollection. The universe is continually waking up to its own divinity. The universe is, to quote Carl Sagan in his Cosmos series, episode 1 of this Cosmos series, which aired on TV in 1980 or so, he said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." All of these are, I think, different ways of expressing the idea of the completion of the circle of existence, which is the evolution of self-knowledge, which is not just the end product of the evolutionary process, but also sparks it at the very beginning, going back to John Wheeler's It from Bit. Anyway, this is a super interesting conversation. We'll definitely make time for that. Hi, Munes.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much. So I may be trying to relate to too many things here, but I was fascinated by the quote you shared where Shirley Fendi talks about Emerson and this whole notion that, religion, and then Shirley Fendi's commentary that religion should not be this religion of the few that have these experiences. Mm-hmm. But we also know that so much of the revelation has been revealed in some form of poetry, right? Like whether it's prose and how there is so much, I think, intentionality behind how Shirley Fendi began the translation process and how we're now trying to continue that to even, maintain and hold on to that voice in English as the writings continue to be translated. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we reconcile, clearly there is power in poetry and in tone and, whatever you want to call the vibrations, right, that we heard about earlier. And yet we also know that mysticism is not purely the experience and we can't overfixate on that. But then I feel like, even in the Iran, Baha'u'llah talks about how, God could have made it very simple and just, made it so that it's just 2 + 2 = 4 and everyone would have seen it, but there's also wisdom in that. And so I don't know, how do we make sense of all of that together?
That's I think that's one of the paradoxes to dive into. On the one hand, and that's where I tried to frame it at the beginning, with that paradox in mind. On the one hand, we have this, almost dire warning, don't get into this for the experience. But it wasn't just Shoghi Effendi who warned that somehow it produces a distortion of the true intent. But Plotinus, St. John of the Cross, there's lots of others who also, I think, thought deeply about this. Thought, well, if the purpose, if like the ultimate spiritual purpose of humanity is to have a spiritual experience, it kind of becomes empty when you think about it, because, well, what happens after that experience? Because the experience is this, like, it's an instantaneous thing. Eyes are open, the birds come down and they sing, and the wind blows, and you have this, the trees burst forth with fruit, and okay, what happens in the next moment? Because the spiritual reality is endless, and so you quickly get to this idea that, well, it can't be about the experience itself. There has to be something more to it. There's and I guess on a side note, has anyone seen the Good Place, the TV series? I mean, many seasons to slog through to get to the end, but worth it, I think, to get to the end and where they land. And I don't want to spoil it. It'd be a big spoiler if I told you how they ended it, but I can't really. I guess I kind of have to spoil it. So plug your ears if you want to watch The Good Place and don't want to know how it ends. But it's an idea of what the afterlife is like, which is like everyday free frozen yogurt and beautiful parks and lovely people and all of that. But at some point, after enough millions of years have passed, you've had enough, and it's time. And you realize that heaven is not about having these experiences, because these experiences can be wonderful, but at some point an experience becomes empty. At some point, a nice experience, it just becomes drained of all of its meaning, and you have to move on to whatever is next. And I think that's, I don't know, this leads into very challenging territory, because our, I think, collective idea of the afterlife, as I've understood it as a Baha'i, and as Baha'is think about it, and as Christians think about it, and Muslims and lots of others, is that, you know, it's a series of fantastic experiences. And I think that when you think about that and you try to multiply it into infinity, you realize that can't be it, or at least that can't be the whole story. And so similarly with mysticism and the sort of idea of mystical illumination, you know, yes, it's a thing. It is most definitely a thing. I mean, the writings are filled with you know, imagery of that moment of mystical illumination. And we're going to spend 1 or 2 sessions on the theme of spiritual transformation, spiritual baptism, the spirit of faith, the divine elixir, a lot of terminology that's deeply embedded in the Baha'i writings and elsewhere, which is very much along with this idea of there being this instantaneous sort of opening of the eyes and this, you know, this experience. But all of these things are metaphors in the end. All of these things are guides to traversing beyond the veil of names. There's an absolutely key quotation passage in a tablet of Baha'u'llah's, which is not yet, I don't think it's yet authorized in translation, but Baha'u'llah says that between us, God, and the creatures is a ladder with 3 steps. He says the first step is the world and all of its vanities. And the second step is the hereafter and all that it contains. And the third step is the kingdom of names. And Baha'u'llah says you have to basically ascend the ladder. And in ascending the ladder, the implication is, you know, with each rung, you realize that the rung that you've just stepped off of is how to function to get you to the next rung. But you realize once you've stepped off that rung, that the whole thing was, you know, is in a way a veil. You know, once you step beyond the veil of this world into the next world, you realized what a veil material possessions are. But Baha'u'llah also indicates that one has to step beyond the hereafter as well. That's only rung 2 in the ladder. And the hereafter and our, you know, collective story about that, our narrative about the nature of the hereafter, we realize is a rung in a ladder. And it leads to another rung, which is escaping from the kingdom of names entirely, which is a subject of several of Baha'u'llah's more recently translated mystical tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved, which we'll be looking at in a few weeks. So I think that takes us beyond our hour. So it is a promised 1 hour, and we've already broken the promise by going 1 hour and 10 minutes. So we should probably wrap up here. I will leave my slides with Arya, and I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Till soon then.